The circumstances of Madison Walker. Madison Walker was born in 1950 in the Deep South, in the small, sweltering town of Alexandria, Louisiana. Her early life was marked by hardship and instability, a cocktail of circumstances that would later shape her choices and the shadow she cast on history. Madison's earliest memories unravel in a modest shotgun house tucked between freight railways and overgrown lots, with the thick summer air buzzing endlessly with cicadas and distant echoes from the local bar down the block. Her father, Frank Walker, a restless man with a gambler's spirit, left home when Madison was only 4 years old. The sudden abandonment shocked their small family, leaving Madison and her mother Evelyn in dire financial and emotional straits. Evelyn, a stoic and resilient woman, worked double shifts at a nurse's station downtown, and at night she would take on odd sewing jobs just to scrape together enough for groceries and rent, which often arrived late. Money became a daily anxiety, and sometimes the two went to bed hungry, learning to accept hand-me-downs from kind neighbors or the local church. Despite the economic struggles, Madison remembered her mother's unwavering strength. Evelyn insisted on keeping her daughter in school, believing education was the only ticket out of poverty. But even the elementary classrooms were not immune to the harsh whispers about the Walkers. Words like abandoned, trash, and trouble found their way to Madison's ears. She felt the sting of social isolation, with few friends and fewer invitations to join in after-school games. As Madison grew, the rough edges of the community became more pronounced. The neighborhoods were policed heavily, but still plagued by petty crime and occasional violence. It was here, in the blurred boundary between neglect and necessity, that Madison learned to keep to herself and distrust strangers. Her teenage years were especially turbulent. With Evelyn working ever longer hours just to keep the lights on, Madison spent more and more time unsupervised, a fact not lost on the older kids who lingered in alleyways or offered her cheap thrills to escape her bleak reality. Adding to this, Alexandria in the 1960s was a cauldron of civil unrest and social change. Poverty drove many youths, including Madison, to desperation. At just 15, she'd already experienced the wrenching heartache of losing her first boyfriend to gang violence, an event that left her emotionally scarred and contributed to her growing sense of mistrust and disillusionment with the world. Through all of this, Madison developed a quiet, steely resolve. She became fiercely protective of her mother and beneath her guarded exterior, nursed a deep longing for safety and belonging, a sense she would chase with tragic consequences for many years to come. A tumultuous adolescence, the coming-of-age years. Madison Walker's teenage years unfolded like a running storm, each season marked by bouts of hope and waves of adversity. After her mother Evelyn bravely opened a small bar on the fringe of downtown Alexandria, the hard-won stability was fragile at best. Madison, growing from a withdrawn child into a striking but guarded young woman, learned to navigate a world where opportunity almost never knocked at her family's door. In those years, the din of the jukebox and the steady flow of patrons at her mother's bar became the soundtrack of Madison's evenings. The bar was equal parts haven and hazard, a place where Madison could earn a few extra dollars bussing tables, overhear stories of heartbreak and betrayal, and sometimes hide from the loneliness that waited for her at home. But it was also a front-row seat to the complexity of adult life. She witnessed disputes between patrons, heard the whispered deals of small-time hustlers, and saw her mother fend off unwanted attention from men who mistook kindness for invitation. At just 15 years old, Madison experienced her first real taste of young love. She fell for Billy Carter, a classmate from her high school whose eager, rebellious spirit drew her in. Billy became her confidant, a brief reprieve from her uncertain reality. The two would meet at sunset by the old railroad tracks, swapping dreams as the cicadas hummed overhead. Yet that fragile bliss was shattered in the fall of 1965, when Billy was caught in a flare-up of local gang violence and lost his life attempting to intervene in a fight that had nothing to do with him. His death devastated Madison, planting deep seeds of grief and distrust. She withdrew further from her peers, her schoolwork began to slide, and her ambitions, once bright, dimmed as the clouds of trauma settled over her days. This period also brought fresh instability at home. Although the bar provided just enough to keep a roof over their heads, it barely shielded them from the city's darker currents. Madison soon became aware of her mother's mounting debts to aggressive lenders and watched as Evelyn's health faltered under the relentless pressure. The stress bled into every corner of their lives, late notices at the door, frenzied arguments about money, and the heavy silence that lingered after each. Madison, coming home alone almost every night, grew sensitive to the smallest hints of danger: the sound of footsteps behind her, a car idling too long on their street, the flicker of suspicion in a stranger's eyes if she wandered too far from the familiar. Without guidance or supervision, Madison was left to form her own rules for survival. She started skipping classes and spending afternoons with a rougher crowd at the edge of the city, kids who found in each other a warped camaraderie out of shared hardship. They smoked cheap cigarettes, shared stolen candies, and dared one another to take ever riskier steps to escape their sense of futility. Shoplifting, minor vandalism, and the quiet thrill of getting away with it became part of Madison's routine, but guilt lurked. She knew her mother would be crushed if she ever found out. Amid all these pressures, the streets of Alexandria in the late 1960s were rife with civil unrest, economic strain, and shifts in social boundaries. Madison watched neighborhoods split along racial and economic lines, sometimes with violence bursting out in the streets, always with fear lurking in the background. The promise of the American dream seemed farther away than ever, especially for a girl who felt invisible to the world's wider possibilities. Despite the chaos, however, Madison's core resilience never faded completely. There were days when she would curl up with a borrowed book and imagine life somewhere new, maybe in a city where no one knew her name and her past couldn't weigh her down. Sometimes in the quiet lull between customers at the bar or just before dawn broke, she allowed herself a whisper of hope, that even a tumultuous youth did not need to define her whole future, that she was more than the sum of her hardships. The first sin and fall. By the time Madison Walker turned 17, her life had already been shaped by a cascade of hard lessons, heartbreak, and simmering resentment toward the world that had dealt her so many cruel hands. Having spent much of her adolescence drifting between unstable apartments, broken promises, and the shadows of her mother's endless sacrifices, Madison carried an invisible burden, a restlessness that prowled just beneath the surface. During her last year of high school in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Madison found herself drawn into a circle of students who, like her, felt pressed to the margins and cut loose from society's opportunities. Among them was Travis Reed, a brash, thrill-seeking 19-year-old who had a reputation for shoplifting and petty scams. Unlike anyone she'd met before, Travis was charismatic and fiercely loyal to those he considered family, and Madison was soon swept up in his aura of rebellion. It started with seemingly harmless dares, skipping school, swiping snacks from corner stores, sneaking into movies. With each act, the sense of nervous excitement grew, numbing the ache of poverty and loneliness. Madison, always vigilant about her mother's struggles to make ends meet, was seduced by the idea of easy money. When Travis suggested something bigger, a late-night break-in at a wealthy businessman's house on the north side of town, Madison hesitated only a moment. The man, a local tax accountant they'd heard kept a safe full of cash and valuables, seemed the sort who could afford a little loss. On a humid August night, Madison and Travis, along with two others from their group, crept through hedges into the backyard. The plan was to slip in, grab as much as they could, and be gone before anyone noticed. But as they rifled through drawers and cracked open jewelry boxes, the unexpected happened. The family's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Green, returned home early from visiting her sick sister. Startled and afraid, Madison froze, adrenaline exploding in her veins. Travis, more impulsive, panicked and lashed out. In the chaos, Mrs. Green ended up mortally wounded, an act that, in the frantic aftermath, no one could cleanly claim or deny. The police responded with remarkable speed, having been tipped off by a neighbor who noticed shadows moving behind the curtains. Within moments, the group's hurried escape unraveled. Sirens split the silence, lights flooded the yard, and they were cornered before they could even reach the street. The entire incident, bungled theft, panicked violence, and swift apprehension, was over in less than 10 minutes. At the police station, the weight of their actions settled over Madison like a dark shroud. She was forced to confront not only the magnitude of what had happened, but also the raw, unfiltered fear of what lay ahead. Madison was charged as an adult, owing to the severity of the crime and the prevailing tough-on-crime attitude in Louisiana courts at the time. After a whirlwind trial, with prosecutors painting her as both a wayward youth and a willing participant in the tragedy, she was sentenced to 7 years in state prison. That first conviction marked the devastating threshold, an abrupt, irreversible fall from grace. Madison, once an invisible girl shaped by circumstance, was now a convicted felon, haunted by the memory of a failed heist that had become her tragic rite of passage into adulthood. The shame and regret, followed her through the cold, echoing halls of the correctional facility and shadowed every hope she had for the future, setting the stage for the years of turmoil and longing that would define her journey. Years in prison and wounds of the heart. Madison Walker's years behind bars marked an indelible transition in her life, one that left scars not only on her record but deep within her psyche. Sentenced as an adult at barely 17, she entered the concrete coldness of the Louisiana State Penitentiary, a sprawling, intimidating complex known among inmates simply as Angola. The sheer size of the prison was overwhelming for such a young woman, and Madison quickly learned how isolation within these walls could crush even the most resilient spirits. She was assigned to a cramped cell with 2 other women, both of them older and already hardened by years of incarceration. The constant noise, the clanking of doors, the shouts, the echoing footsteps, became her new soundtrack. Trying to balance vigilance with submission, she observed the unspoken rules of survival in the penitentiary. Trust was both currency and curse in Angola. Some inmates offered fleeting friendship, but betrayal was never far behind. Madison mostly kept to herself, fearful that even the gentlest overtures might be traps. Daily routines were oppressive, defined by rigid schedules and a lack of privacy. Prison work details, laundry, kitchen, custodial, were physically taxing and mentally numbing. Madison preferred the laundry room, where the hot steam and rhythmic work offered a private cocoon to disappear into her thoughts. But the monotony soon wore thin, and each night she would collapse onto the hard cot, haunted by images of her crime and the desperate moments leading up to her arrest. What Madison would never speak aloud, what she buried deep, was the trauma she endured behind bars. As a young woman among a population fraught with tension and unspoken desperation, she became a target for intimidation, harassment, and manipulation. There were nights she would lie awake, listening to whispered threats or the distant wails of women succumbing to the darkness. Once, in her second year, she suffered an assault by a fellow inmate, an experience that imprinted itself as a permanent source of shame and panic. She never reported it, fearing the retaliation and stigma that often accompanied such accusations. Her relationship with authority was fraught. Madison loathed the correctional officers, most of whom treated the inmates with dismissive cruelty or condescension. Moving through chow lines or security checks, she felt herself shrink, fighting the sense of powerlessness. Occasionally, 1 or 2 counselors attempted to reach out to her, but she remained guarded, unwilling to grant anyone access to her wounded interior. The outside world, meanwhile, faded to a memory. Her mother, already fragile from a lifetime of hardship, could only visit a handful of times each year, and each visit was a wrenching reminder of the gulf growing between them. Madison's letters home dwindled as the months dragged on, her shame stifling each attempt to express herself. Holidays and birthdays became indistinguishable from other days, and she came to mark time in units of silence and solitude. Yet even in this bleakness, Madison's will was not wholly broken. She began to read voraciously from the meager prison library, gravitating toward novels and memoirs of people who had lost their way, but somehow found a path back. Sometimes she would scribble poetry in the margins of old newspapers, letting the words be both confession and escape. She listened for the music that drifted through the corrugated walls from the prison chapel, taking comfort in the faint memories of her old life when possibilities had not yet been crushed by circumstance. When, after 6 grueling years, Madison finally stood before the parole board, she was not the same girl who had once run wild through Alexandria's streets. She had grown colder, yes, but also wise to the cost of every decision. Her wounds, physical, emotional, invisible, would never truly heal. Freedom, when granted, felt almost like an illusion, for she left Angola with her spirit battered, forever carrying the twin burdens of regret and resilience. Beginning a new life and love with full of anxiety. After Madison Walker was finally released from the suffocating walls of Louisiana State Penitentiary, she found herself standing at a crossroads that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The world outside had changed while she languished behind bars. Cities buzzed with a new kind of energy, fashions had shifted, and it seemed like everyone was in a constant rush chasing after dreams she felt estranged from. Yet more than anything, it was the chance, fragile though it seemed, for a clean slate that made her heart beat unsteadily each morning. Parole sent her west to Dallas, Texas, a city where anonymity mingled with opportunity. Dallas was sprawling, its neighborhoods a patchwork of hope and struggle, shimmering with a sense that anything was possible if you could just slip past the eyes trained to look for trouble. Madison found a small apartment in a shabby but lively part of the city, just a few blocks from a strip of bars, diners, and aging motels. The space was cramped, the window blinds permanently tilted to keep prying eyes out, but for Madison, it was freedom, a place to build herself up again from nothing but willpower and a battered suitcase. She took a job as a bartender at a dusty corner bar called Sullivan's Tap Room. The work was hard, the pay was barely enough to cover rent and groceries, but she preferred the dim lighting and the anonymity it brought. At night, Madison would mix drinks with steady hands, field crude jokes, and eavesdrop on the stories of strangers who drifted in from every walk of life. It was in this swirl of glass and neon that Jonathan appeared, a regular with tired eyes, a kind smile, and a voice that was careful never to pry. Jonathan was a mechanic by trade in his early 40s and seemed to carry his own private universe of regrets and silent wishes. He'd come in after his shifts, order the same whiskey and soda, and tip generously no matter how little he seemed to have. Unlike the other men who tried their luck with flirting or brash stories, Jonathan asked Madison about her day, about the books she sometimes carried, about the music she played on the jukebox. Their bond grew quietly, giving Madison a sense of warmth she hadn't felt in years, a feeling both healing and terrifying. Trust came slowly, layered between carefully chosen words and the comfort of routines. Madison was painfully aware of her past, the permanent stain of her criminal record, and the countless nights she'd spent replaying her worst mistakes behind locked doors. She kept Jonathan at arm's length emotionally, living under the dread that any revelation about her past would shatter the life she was building, the fragile affection growing between them, and the second chance she was so desperate to preserve. Madison fabricated fragments of her history, blaming a failed marriage, a complicated family, the southern restlessness that drove her to Texas, instead of offering the truth rooted in violence and shame. Jonathan, for his part, was patient to a fault. He never pressed her for details. Part of Madison suspected that, like many who'd taken hard roads themselves, he recognized the signs of a battered soul. Still, underneath every quiet evening or gentle touch was a razor edge of anxiety. Simple moments, someone glancing too long in the bar, a police patrol lingering near the entrance, a news bulletin in the background, would send panic sparking beneath Madison's carefully arranged calm. She rehearsed excuses in her head, always ready to run at the first sign of suspicion. There were bright spots, too. Sometimes after closing, Jonathan would walk Madison home under the city's flickering streetlights, their conversations meandering from hopeful dreams to silly confessions. He brought her wildflowers he picked on the way to work, and once, on her birthday, surprised her with a second-hand book of poetry he'd seen her reading. These acts chipped away Madison's fortress of mistrust, leaving her caught between longing for normalcy and fearing the consequences of feeling safe again. But loving, for Madison, was forever tangled with guilt. She wondered if she would ever deserve real happiness, or if the echo of her crimes would always haunt the edges of her existence. In Jonathan, she found the possibility of being seen fully and accepted, but the same possibility filled her with dread, because if he ever truly knew her, every fragile hope she dared to hold close might disappear overnight. Every day then was a balancing act, a quiet, anxious dance between love, secrecy, and the ever-present shadow of her past life. The event leading to a new crime. As the summer of 1983 pressed down on Dallas with tired heat and sticky evenings, the fragile scaffolding of Madison Walker's new life at Sullivan's Tap Room was beginning to crack under pressures she could no longer hide. Dallas, with its relentless rhythm and bustling promise, had once seemed the perfect city for reinvention, a sanctuary for someone desperate to outrun her own history. But in reality, each hard-won moment of normalcy stacked a new layer of anxiety onto Madison's overloaded nerves. Money was always tight. Even as she clung to her bartending job and watched Jonathan scrape by in his mechanic's coveralls, bills seemed to multiply overnight. Madison lived in constant limbo, haunted by the financial landmines of the past. Medical debts from her mother's final illness, missed rent payments, the threatening letters that piled up in the kitchen drawer. Each payday, there was a brief illusion of control, only to be shattered by another urgent expense. Madison's fear of slipping back into desperation was so acute it sometimes choked her. Yet it wasn't just money that weighed on Madison. For all the warm camaraderie at the bar, for the compassion she started to feel toward regular customers, and for the budding, hesitant love with Jonathan, she remained an outsider. She nursed her secrets like wounds. Each joke shared over the counter or gentle touch at closing time carried the risk of exposure. That fear kept her tense, watching every word, compulsively checking locks. She never allowed herself to feel truly safe. Even in moments of affection, Jonathan's hand brushing hers, his careful smile, Madison felt as if she were standing on a cliff, with the wind of the past threatening to push her over. Then came Evelyn, her co-worker and only friend at Sullivan's. Evelyn worked the morning shift, but their paths often crossed. She was in her early 40s, divorced with 2 kids, and possessed an easy laugh that belied her own collection of hurts. Evelyn had taken Madison under her wing since her first shaky shift, showing her how to handle rowdy customers, which suppliers to trust, and which back alley doors to avoid late at night. The 2 women bonded over their struggles, and though Evelyn pressed gently for the truth of Madison's story, she never pushed too far, sensing the raw edges under Madison's surface. That summer, though, Madison noticed a shift. Evelyn's cheer began to dull. Work stress seemed endless. Rumors of the bar changing ownership meant whispers of layoffs, tightening cash flow, and the constant worry that next month, neither of them would have a job. They started trading stories of mounting bills, the price of groceries, the way rent hikes seemed to come faster than wage increases. Madison's anxiety became Evelyn's, and vice versa, a circuit of mutual fear with no clear exit. For Madison, things hit a tipping point in late July when a series of overdue notices arrived in quick succession. Utilities, rent, a creditor threatening court action. Her carefully budgeted life broke apart. More than once she found herself staring at her meager savings and wondering how she and Jonathan could possibly keep afloat. Nights grew restless. Madison snapped at Jonathan for small things, dirty boots by the door, a missed dinner, and hated herself for it. Her old instincts crept back in, the urge to hide, to run, to do anything necessary to survive. When the bar's owner announced that he might be selling, panic surged. Madison knew she couldn't afford to lose Sullivan's. Desperation clung to her like sweat. She tried to pick up extra shifts, pawned her jewelry, but it wasn't enough. She even considered, and then quickly dismissed, a phone call to her estranged family in Louisiana. She had burned too many bridges there. One Friday, after a double shift, Madison confided in Evelyn over a shared smoke break. Her voice trembled as she recounted the bills, her mother's death, every looming threat. Evelyn listened quietly, her face tightening with concern. "I wish I could help, honey," she replied softly, "but I'm drowning myself." Still, she offered a small loan, $100 she scraped together from tips. Madison was grateful but ashamed that it barely made a dent. Days later, after a particularly exhausting week, Madison arrived at work to find Evelyn on the verge of tears. The new owner had come by that morning and threatened staff cuts. "It doesn't look good for us," Evelyn confided. Jonathan too confided that business at the garage was slowing to a crawl. The walls were closing in from every side. That night, after her shift, Madison sat alone in her apartment, fighting off despair and growing anger, at herself, at the world, at the unfathomable cruelty of fate. It was after midnight when Madison made her decision. She visited Evelyn's old apartment, hoping to plead one last time for help, or perhaps, as she told herself, just to talk. Maybe in truth, she only wanted reassurance that she wasn't alone. The conversation began tense and quickly unraveled. Madison's desperation was obvious, and Evelyn, already overburdened, finally snapped. Words flew, accusations, pent-up resentments, the kind of harsh truths friends sometimes inflict when pushed to the edge. In that moment of emotional chaos, something in Madison broke. The years of repression, sorrow, and fear spun into reckless violence. There was a struggle, angry, clumsy, desperate, culminating in a tragic accident. Madison, disoriented, barely registered her own actions. The finality of the act dawned only in the hush that followed. Evelyn motionless, Madison's hands trembling, the world abruptly silent. Guilt and horror collided in Madison's mind. Everything that followed felt dreamlike. Madison's fight-or-flight instincts took over. In panic, she called Jonathan, barely able to articulate what had happened. Jonathan, shocked but too loyal to turn her in, rushed over. Together, their hands shaking with adrenaline, they swore to cover up the crime. Out of blind fear and impulsive self-preservation, they wrapped Evelyn's body in an old blanket, loading her quietly into the trunk of Jonathan's battered Oldsmobile. Driving through the empty, humid streets of Dallas, Madison's thoughts raced from terror to numbness. They chose a remote wooded area outside the city, a place known only to Jonathan from night fishing trips. There, with trembling hands and silent tears, they buried Evelyn, erasing all visible traces and driving back in dawn's uncertain light. Madison felt as if she left a part of herself behind in that earth, the remnant of a woman who still believed in new beginnings. In the aftermath, Madison and Jonathan drifted through the days on autopilot. She waited for the world to close in around her with sirens, headlines, relentless questions, but nothing happened, at least not right away. Instead, a haunted quiet settled over her life. Madison wasn't sure what she feared more, getting caught, or simply having to live with what she'd done. The guilt was relentless. She checked news reports obsessively, jumping at every knock on the door. Even the smallest inconvenience, a late-night call, a misplaced letter, spiked panic. At Sullivan's, her coworkers noticed a new edge to her demeanor, nervous, brittle, hollow-eyed. She avoided the subject of Evelyn's abrupt disappearance. Jonathan, too, grew distant, his silence a reflection of his own mounting dread. Yet for a while they both clung to the desperate hope that perhaps they'd escaped the worst. Madison's life became a nightly prayer for just one more day before discovery. A fragile faith destined, it seemed, to unravel. Madison's mind teetered on the edge. Every hour now turned into a battle with regret and paranoia. She replayed the argument, the accidental death, the panicked burial on a constant loop. Sleep became fragmentary at best. Nightmares would jolt her awake, Evelyn's voice echoing in her ear, her heart hammering. In daylight, the ordinary world, traffic, laughter drifting from a neighbor's window, the rattle of kitchen utensils, felt sharpened, colored by the knowledge that she was now someone else entirely, no longer just a survivor but someone with fresh blood on her hands. Distrust crept in, poisoning even her tentative relationship with Jonathan. The secret bound them irrevocably. Still, Madison couldn't shake the suspicion that he blamed her, that his loyalty might crumble if the stress became too much. They started fighting, tiny arguments at first, then explosive showdowns over things as trivial as Thomas the cat knocking over a vase, or a lost envelope. The tension made their small apartment feel like a prison cell. When they weren't arguing, they barely spoke, circling each other in awkward silence. Each, in their own way, mourned the loss of the hopeful life they'd been constructing. Meanwhile, the absence of Evelyn at Sullivan's taproom did not go unnoticed. For years, Evelyn had been a fixture in the neighborhood. Her sudden disappearance fueled gossip. Some regulars whispered about a sudden job offer or a family emergency. Others speculated darker things. The new owner, more preoccupied with numbers than with people, made a cursory inquiry, fired off a few calls, and quickly moved on. Madison did what she could to deflect suspicion, insisting Evelyn had simply moved away, that she'd heard from her and she was fine. She overcompensated at work, smiling too brightly, helping other staff, acting unbothered. But the act was exhausting and cracks appeared quickly. Police eventually came to the bar, asking routine questions about Evelyn's whereabouts. Madison managed to answer in measured tones, offering rehearsed lies she hoped sounded plausible. Jonathan provided her an alibi when needed, both of them desperately trying to keep their stories straight. But each interaction left Madison rattled. She obsessed over small details. Had she slipped up? Did they suspect? And scrutinized the faces of everyone around her for signs of doubt. Her world narrowed. She didn't answer her phone except for Jonathan or work. She withdrew from friends, ignored old acquaintances. Any comfort she found in Dallas evaporated, replaced by a bone-deep dread. Sometimes Madison caught herself looking in the mirror and barely recognized the woman she saw. Guarded eyes, tense jaw, exhaustion etched into every feature. She took to carrying cash, packing go-bags with essentials in case escape became necessary. She memorized the locations of local motels and mapped back roads out of Dallas. The line between survival and pure paranoia blurred so completely that even Madison couldn't say which side she was living on anymore. It was, she realized bleakly, a return to the old patterns she'd tried so hard to leave behind, running, hiding, watching life through a crack in the door. The difference now was that she knew, deep down, there were some wounds time and distance would never heal. Despite the darkness, Madison sometimes caught herself yearning for forgiveness, wondering if redemption was even possible. But every attempt to imagine confession, turning herself in, facing the truth, unleashed terror at the thought of prison, of losing Jonathan, of being stripped of every fragile thing she'd managed to build. So she did what she always had, endured, day by day, hoping maybe, just maybe, the past could stay buried. Until the next crisis, until she could run no more. The first escape journey. Madison's first journey into a life of flight didn't begin with a dramatic car chase or sirens in the distance, but with a heavy, chilling silence. The city of Dallas, once filled with neon promises and strangers' laughter, now felt like a tight web closing in around her. After the frantic, clandestine burial of Evelyn, Madison's nerves throbbed with dread during each waking moment. Her mind replayed the events like a broken reel. It was as if the walls themselves whispered accusations. The guilt was relentless, but even more pressing was the knowledge that the clock was ticking. The world would soon notice what she'd done, and there would be nowhere to hide. Jonathan, her partner in life and now in crime, could barely look her in the eye. Their shared apartment, once a fleeting sanctuary, turned cold and unfamiliar. They barely spoke except in tense whispered fragments about practicalities. What to do if the police came, how to keep their stories straight, which of Madison's belongings to leave behind in case she had to disappear at a moment's notice. Sleep was scarce for them both. Madison lay awake, flinching at the smallest sound from the street below, heart leaping whenever headlights swept over the windows. One night, after 3 days of this unbearable standoff, Jonathan finally spoke plainly. "It's not safe for you here anymore." Parting with Jonathan was painful and abrupt. He pressed a thin wad of bills into her hand and wrote down the number of a trucker friend who owed him a favor. Madison, her head spinning, packed a battered suitcase and a change of clothes into an old duffel bag. At dawn, she slipped silently from the apartment, taking the back stairs and never looking back. The morning was gray and sticky as she made her way to the edge of the city, heart hammering with each step. She felt invisible and exposed at the same time, as though every person she passed knew her secrets. The trucker, Randy, was a grizzled man with tired eyes and a slow drawl. He didn't ask questions. For cash, he let Madison ride along as he hauled freight to Shreveport, then Baton Rouge. Hidden among crates of industrial parts, she became a ghost, careful not to leave any trails. No credit cards, no personal calls, just the shadow life between truck stops and back roads. Every gas station bathroom was a place to wash up and catch a shaky breath. The food was bad, the sleep worse. But at least she was moving, and that gave her hope she might outrun the consequences a little longer. Arriving in Baton Rouge only deepened her paranoia. The city wasn't home. Madison hadn't set foot there since her turbulent teenage years, but the streets felt just familiar enough to set her nerves alight. She found a dingy motel on the outskirts, paid cash, and kept the TV on at all times for comforting noise, and for any mention of her name on the news. Days dragged into each other as she waited for the storm to break. She scoured the want ads for under-the-table work, eventually picking up shifts at a rundown diner under a fake name. The hours were long, the boss suspicious, but what mattered was paying for the next week's rent and ensuring nobody remembered her face. Hiding in plain sight became her new specialty. Madison learned to forge new routines, switch motels every week or so, never walk the same route twice, burn anything with her fingerprints on it. She dyed her hair, swapped IDs with the help of a waitress's shady cousin, and adopted a new accent. The persona she created, conveniently shy, always transient, kept people at bay. Yet, the loneliness ate at her. She missed Jonathan in ways she didn't dare dwell on, and even her fractured memories of Evelyn haunted her dreams. The anxiety worsened when, one afternoon, 2 men in cheap suits came into the diner and flashed badges at the manager. Madison ducked out the back, hands shaking so badly she could hardly unlock her bike. She left Baton Rouge that night, hitchhiking west under a torrential downpour, determined to put even more miles between herself and her past. Her next stop was Houston, then New Orleans, a host of southern cities that all blended together, never staying long enough to lay down roots, always making her life fit into a single bag. She learned to move quietly through the world, to blend into the blur of American highways and urban sprawl. She took whatever work she could, house cleaning, night shift cashier, fruit picking along the highways. Her skills sharpened. She could sense suspicion before a question was asked, read people's motives from a single glance. Sometimes, at anonymous bus stops or in the overnight diners, she would strike up small conversations just to feel real again, inventing false backstories while longing to confess the truth. But as months became years, Madison adapted, toughening to the ever-present fear of being exposed. The rare phone call to Jonathan was always brief and conducted from payphones miles apart. She never dared send a letter, never risked contacting her old friends or what little family she had left in Louisiana. Each city felt both promising and threatening, a maze to survive for a handful of months before starting over once again. Still, the close calls piled up. In Little Rock, someone at a shelter recognized her for a split second, a woman from Madison's old life who fixed her with a puzzled stare that Madison just barely evaded. In Memphis, a routine traffic stop while she was a passenger left her sweating buckets, the officer's gaze lingering on her too long as he checked her ID. Madison learned to sense these threats, to listen for the shift in a stranger's tone or the knots in her own gut. Every day was a practice in vigilance, every encounter an exercise in escaping notice. Through it all, the ache of guilt never left her, twinned with the primal urge to survive. Memories of Evelyn, of Jonathan, of her fractured life before the crime haunted her nights. In dark motel rooms, Madison sometimes scribbled in a notebook she never dared to keep for long, writing letters to people she missed, to the woman she used to be, to the idea of forgiveness. The words brought little relief, but the ritual made her feel less erased by the anonymity of her new life. She promised herself she would never get caught off guard again. As Madison drifted through the patchwork of Southern America, she became a master at leaving no footprints. She crossed rivers at dawn, changed her appearance, stashed emergency cash in stitched-up clothing linings, and scanned every face for signs of suspicion. And yet, deep down, she knew this wasn't freedom. It was survival on borrowed time, a restless, exhausting chase where the person she feared most was always herself, staring back from dusty mirrors in 1,000 forgettable rooms. Her first journey as a fugitive set the pattern for the years that followed: perpetual motion, shifting identities, haunted dreams, and a never-ending sense that the world was always one step away from closing in. For Madison Walker, escape had become a way of life, even as it exacted a price she wasn't sure she'd ever stop paying: changing appearance to conceal identity. After months clinging to a shadow life marked by paranoia and exhaustion, Madison Walker reached a critical crossroads. Continuing as herself, even with forged names and caution, was no longer sustainable. She saw her own face reflected too often, smeared on television crime reports, sketched on wanted posters, ghosting in the suspicious glance of a stranger passing by. Every look felt accusatory, every moment in public space threatened exposure. The air seemed charged with her guilt, and each day brought a sense that time was running out. The decision to fundamentally change her appearance and identity wasn't just desperate, it was terrifying. She'd spent years adapting, learned to melt into the backdrop of diners, bus stations, and motels, but her face was a liability. Through a network of black market contacts she'd formed while adrift, Madison made tentative inquiries. Could anyone help her disappear, truly disappear, so the FBI and local police would hunt in vain? It took weeks to arrange, and even longer for her to muster the courage needed. Eventually, a chain of whispered references led her to an aging doctor in a rundown Houston office, infamous among fugitives but invisible to the authorities. The risk was enormous, but Madison saw no alternative. She walked into the dim-lit waiting room clutching a roll of stolen cash, pulse thundering out questions she never dared to voice. Was this the end of her old self, or just the beginning of another mask? The procedure itself was grueling. Madison handed her future over to the surgeon, who set cold tools against her skin and erased decades of familiarity. Bone structure, cheeks, chin, and nose, minor adjustments all, yet together they produced a stranger's face. The healing process took weeks and left her painfully swollen, bruised, and unrecognizable in more ways than one. At night she'd stare into a warped motel bathroom mirror, cataloging each stitch of transformation, murmuring her old name like a fading incantation, afraid she might lose herself for good. After the bandages finally came off, she struggled to connect with her reflection. Gone was the sharp chin of her youth, the narrow nose, the scar above her brow from a long-ago childhood accident. In her place was a woman who could pass for anyone, Sarah Anderson, the new name she'd purchased along with a fraudulent Social Security card and driver's license. Her old mannerisms had to die too. She practiced smiles, crafted a calm and measured way of speaking, and even adjusted her walk, copying the confident stride she admired in strangers passing by. Every detail mattered. Forging a new identity wasn't just about appearance. Madison, now Sarah, knew she had to rewrite her habits, suppress old instincts, and invent plausible backstories. She painstakingly destroyed anything that could hint at her prior identity: photographs, handwritten notes, even a childhood necklace. Her fingerprints had long since been burned off with lye, a brutal, self-inflicted ritual that sent her to the ER once with infected blisters, but granted her the cruel freedom from routine employment background checks. Re-entering society as Sarah Anderson meant taking menial jobs and living on the move. She traveled from Houston to Atlanta, Chicago, then Nashville, never staying long enough in any city for roots to take hold. In Nashville, however, Sarah found a peculiar niche. She landed a job as an overnight baker in a family-run pastry shop. The hours meant fewer prying eyes, and the small, bustling circle of co-workers provided community while keeping things impersonal. Her hands became skilled at dough, her forearms burned with the heat of ovens, and the hours passed in a comforting blur, distant from her haunted past. Sarah's dedication and steady presence eventually earned her a promotion to assistant manager. In this new role she learned to balance books, handle payroll, and order supplies, the perfect camouflage. Her calm demeanor and willingness to work thankless hours made her a fixture in the shop. Over time, some neighbors and employees speculated about her past, her reticence, her obvious discomfort when topics turned to family or old times, but her decency and quiet competence discouraged prying. She never let herself get too close to anyone, insisting on boundaries as a matter of life and death. To further distance herself from risk, Sarah also set up multiple layers of false documentation. She acquired backup IDs under aliases, Jane Cooper in Florida, Melissa Jones in Missouri, so that if her Sarah Anderson persona was compromised, she could vanish again. She memorized every fact in each invented biography, as if cramming for the role of her life. She even went so far as to watch regional news in every city she arrived in, making sure her story could plausibly match with local events if needed. Yet none of these changes truly erased the anxiety lurking beneath her new exterior. Madison, though everyone now called her Sarah, could not ignore a deep sense of loss. She'd intentionally severed all links to Jonathan, friends, and any remnants of her family in Louisiana. The phone numbers she once memorized, the familiar handwriting she'd cherished, and even the old recipes her mother had taught her, she forced herself to forget, carving away her past as cruelly as the surgeon had changed her face. There were nights in Nashville when Sarah would linger at the window, watching the city's lights flicker like distant constellations above the skyline. She wondered about the lives she'd left behind. Sometimes she caught herself nearly answering to Madison from a customer or a delivery man, calling out, her heart pounding at the near mistake. The paranoia never fully dissipated. Each day brought the chance a regular might recognize her from an old composite sketch, or that her fingerprints would somehow be matched through a careless touch. Sarah became a master of discretion. She always wore gloves while cleaning, avoided being photographed, and never used the same bank twice. She limited her social circle to a handful of co-workers, careful to reveal only what was safe and necessary, never letting slip the truth about her fugitive existence. When the bakery owner invited her to a 4th of July barbecue, she invented a headache and spent the evening alone, clutching a faded paperback with trembling hands. One of her greatest struggles was with loneliness. Living life in disguise meant suppressing all longing for close connections, honesty, or comfort. She could not afford tears, nostalgia, or the luxury of trusting anyone. There was always the risk, a drunken regular remembering a news report, an offhand question about her accent, a police cruiser idling too long outside the bakery's lot. The stakes were literally freedom versus a lifetime locked away. Trying to maintain balance in that precarious existence, Sarah began to find small measures of comfort in routine. Over time she grew fond of the bakery's easy rhythms, the gentle thud of dough on the table each morning, the smell of melted butter, the simple camaraderie of the kitchen staff. She established her own little rituals, a walk before work at sunrise, a cup of strong coffee enjoyed in solitude, a dog-eared notebook in which she scribbled memories she could not bring herself to destroy. Even as she maintained emotional distance from others, these minor comforts kept her grounded in a world that so often felt alien. Sarah's greatest achievement, and her secret bittersweet solace, was the rekindling of a connection with her son. Years after leaving Jonathan and the old life behind, she tentatively reached out through underground contacts and managed to arrange for her eldest child, now a young man, to work at the same bakery under a different surname. For months no one suspected their connection. She watched him from a distance, his careful mannerisms, the way he handled a rolling pin, the hesitance in his smile. The presence of her son brought both consolation and a dagger to her heart. She longed desperately to embrace him, to share stories and laughter, to confess her true identity and beg his forgiveness. But the ever-present fear of being recognized, of drawing attention to herself or implicating her son, kept her affections strictly contained. She played the role of a firm yet distant manager, rarely allowing herself more than an approving nod or a gentle correction. Still, those brief interactions became a lifeline, reminding her that some threads from her old life resisted even the harshest attempts at severance. Despite the seeming stability Sarah cultivated, old anxieties lingered just beneath her professionally guarded surface. On more than one occasion, she caught a co-worker glancing too long at her, or saw a customer snap a photo for innocent reasons, and felt panic rising in her chest. Worst were the moments when her son, unaware of the full danger, spoke too casually in public or referenced a detail from her past. The tension was constant, like a taut wire stretched between two lives, one already lost, and another always on the verge of being uncovered. Coping mechanisms became a means of survival. Sarah developed the habit of quietly moving money through several small accounts, keeping emergency cash and a backup set of new ID papers hidden in a false bottom suitcase. She memorized the exits from every building she entered, and always had an alibi rehearsed, should anyone ever ask how Sarah Anderson ended up in Nashville. Even small setbacks, a failed bakery inspection, a suspicious phone call, sent her spiraling into contingency planning mode. Where would she go next? Would she run north, or try starting over west of the Mississippi? She also became adept at blending in culturally. Sarah picked up the local accent, learned the differences in how people from East and Middle Tennessee talked, and became familiar with their customs, whether it was small-town football rivalries or the local farmers' markets. She kept abreast of neighborhood gossip, reading between the lines for signs of deeper suspicion, and was always careful to present herself as friendly but guarded, approachable yet forgettable. Her deepest hope was that, by becoming unremarkable, she'd finally be left in peace. But even as Madison, now almost fully transformed into Sarah, settled into her new routine, she could never silence the voice in her mind reminding her of the fragility of her freedom. An unexpected police investigation one street over could crumble her carefully constructed new self. A single out-of-place comment, or the return of someone from her past, could unravel everything. This knowledge cast a shadow over even her most ordinary days. Every kindness offered by a coworker, every compliment on a batch of blueberry muffins, every quiet moment on the bakery's back stoop carried the underlying question: would this be the day she would finally be found out? In quieter hours, Sarah wrestled with the isolation, guilt, and longing that marked her existence. She wrote secret letters to her former self, letters she would later burn, and read newspapers obsessively for any hint that the search for Madison Walker might finally wane. She wondered, as each year passed, whether one day she could let her guard down, if forgiveness or peace was ever truly within reach for someone who wore so many faces. Every new day brought a renewal of her resolve to survive, to endure, to protect the shreds of connection she'd managed to save, all while counting the silent, steady years she'd managed to remain invisible in plain sight, hiding beneath a new shell. As Sarah Anderson, Madison Walker found herself treading the fragile boundary between reinvention and perpetual fear. With her features subtly altered by surgery, and a new set of false documents tucked carefully away, Madison moved through each day with a methodical caution she could never have imagined in her former life. Every morning she stared into the mirror, searching her new reflection for signs of the old Madison, wondering if anyone, anywhere, would be able to see through her. Sometimes, in moments of quiet, she barely recognized the woman she had become. Nashville was a city of music, bright lights, and endless crowds, a place where a fugitive could, just possibly, become invisible. As Sarah, she secured a position at a small neighborhood bakery, eventually rising to manage the storefront thanks to her relentless work ethic and the peculiar charm she had acquired from a lifetime spent listening more than talking. She learned the rhythms of this new city, the early morning rush of customers, the behind-the-scenes banter of her employees, local gossip swirling in the air like flour dust. Building trust was both a necessity and a liability. Madison, now Sarah, kept the lines of intimacy carefully blurred. She was always friendly, always willing to lend a hand, but kept her deepest self hidden. When coworkers asked about her family, she spun vague, believable stories of a childhood in upstate New York or a failed marriage down south. Her accent sometimes slipped, but most took it for transplanted roots, a curiosity, not a clue. Managing the bakery became her salvation and penance. The physicality of long hours, mixing dough, stocking shelves, placing orders with suppliers, grounded her in the present moment, pushing old nightmares to the background. There was solace in the repetition, anchoring her tumultuous mind. Sarah also knew the importance of blending in, so she became involved in community events, donated unsold pastries to local shelters, and joined neighborhood meetings. People came to rely on her, and in a strange, bittersweet way she felt seen, at least her new version did. Yet beneath each seemingly ordinary day simmered a relentless undercurrent of anxiety. Anytime a new face entered the shop, Sarah's pulse would quicken. She memorized the habits and routines of her regulars, cataloging the smallest changes in their demeanor. She pictured herself on an endless knife's edge. If she slipped up, if she allowed her guard to drop, it could all unravel in moments. There were days when she longed for genuine connection, but even the simplest kindnesses, like a warm gesture from a customer or a thoughtful question from an employee, forced her to shore up her emotional walls. The greatest test of her resolve came when her son, under the name Mark, joined her in the bakery. She had arranged for him, now nearly grown and unaware of his mother's full past, to come work as a part-timer. The distance between them was an ache she carried, yet keeping him close seemed to offer some redemption. Madison played the role of supportive employer meticulously, never too affectionate in public, but always attentive enough to guide him, encourage him, and silently protect him from the shadows of her world. Their connection, though coded and reserved, gave Madison fragile hope. Watching Mark adapt to this new place, the easy camaraderie he built, his laughter echoing during busy mornings, reminded her of the life she'd always wanted. At the same time, the presence of her son risked everything. Any slip, any offhand remark, could raise questions about their past, could expose the rift between reality and the lies Madison so carefully constructed. She lost sleep over nightmares of customers whispering about family resemblances, of authorities piecing together her long-buried secrets. Keeping every thread of her story straight became a second full-time job. She maintained several sets of identification, rotated through backup addresses and burner phones, and paid attention to the news for signs of renewed interest in the Walker case. Sometimes she'd wake in the middle of the night, convinced she'd heard sirens outside her apartment, only to realize it was just another echo of her restless conscience. The pressure was relentless. Never slip up, never relax. As the months crawled by, Sarah was both accepted and set apart, known and yet always on the edge of being found out. She went through each day acutely aware that the world she'd built could collapse at the faintest hint of her true identity. Despite her longing for belonging, Madison learned that safety in her new skin came at the cost of honesty, and that to hide beneath a new identity was not the same as being free. She had become a master of survival, but the price was constant, lonely vigilance, suspended forever beneath the thin veneer of someone else's life. Suspicious signs and a thrilling chase. The first hint of suspicion crept into Madison's new life subtly, a single disconcerting glance, a comment that seemed too knowing, a moment of silence that lingered just a beat too long. Under her new identity as Sarah Anderson in Nashville, she worked tirelessly to build an existence that felt authentic and unremarkable. The bakery was busy, her routines well-practiced, and she moved through each day with studied caution. Yet living as a fugitive meant never truly feeling safe. The past always seemed to ripple just beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect angle to make itself known again. The first real sign came from a man named Kenny, the brother of her new boyfriend Mark. Kenny had always been a little prickly, slow to trust newcomers and interested in people's stories, an amateur sleuth in his own right. One Sunday afternoon Madison noticed him watching her, his eyes narrowed as if he was flipping through a mental Rolodex of faces he'd seen before. Later that week, when she went to grab fresh flour from the supply closet, she overheard Kenny and Mark speaking in hushed tones. Her name, well, Sarah Anderson, buzzed in the air, edged with doubt. The tension in the bakery transformed from subtle to palpable, swirling around Madison with every tentative smile and nervous laugh. Soon after, odd questions began popping up. A regular customer who seemed unusually curious asked where she'd come from. Others started joking about having seen her on TV, in a crime show perhaps, or in the background of a news segment. Each interaction, harmless on the surface, gnawed at Madison's nerves, rekindling the anxiety she'd spent years trying to silence. She doubled down on her efforts to blend in, kept her answers vague but friendly, and made sure to leave no trace of her real history behind. But she could feel the walls closing in. At night, sleep was nearly impossible, her mind racing with ways she could alter her appearance again, find a new job, or totally reinvent herself for the 100th time. Then came the day everything changed. Kenny, an amateur computer whiz, gained access to some public records after his curiosities were piqued by inconsistencies in Madison's story. Little errors in birthplace, discrepancies over her supposed hometown, changes in her accent on particularly stressful days. He dug further, eventually cross-referencing names and faces from online news archives. He found an old photo, grainy but unmistakably Madison before her transformation, attached to an unsolved case in Louisiana, and a missing persons report from Texas. The puzzle pieces snapped into place. Kenny confronted Mark, and Mark, torn between disbelief and dawning realization, decided to approach the police, just to be sure. When Madison sensed things were spiraling out of control, her instincts kicked in. The next 48 hours became a blur. She packed a go-bag with essential cash, burned every piece of paper that could link her to Sarah Anderson, and wiped her phone clean. That same night, she noticed an unmarked sedan idling across from her apartment parking lot. The bakery felt suddenly hostile, every coworker a potential informant, every shadow potentially hiding federal agents. She withdrew money from several ATMs, taking no more than a few $100s at a time, crisscrossing the city on foot, always doubling back to check if she was being tailed. By the time news broke, a vague report about a person of interest, matching Madison's earlier description, she was already planning her exit from Nashville. But this time, the authorities were prepared. The moment the police report was filed, the information was shared across law enforcement channels. Local officers, state troopers, and, most alarmingly, the FBI were all now in sync. Madison wasn't just running from her personal demons any longer, she was in a full-scale, high-stakes chase. She switched rental cars twice in a single day, wearing a baseball cap pulled low and sunglasses that made her look almost invisible in the sea of highway travelers. But no disguise fully masked the urgency in her manner. She drove fast, checking every rearview mirror, avoiding toll roads and major highways. Nevertheless, electronic traces lagged behind her every move. A credit card mistakenly used for gas in Franklin, a security camera snapshot from a convenience store in Murfreesboro, a receipt dropped in a hurry. Back in Nashville, the bakery was crawling with police and agents. Her coworkers, once friends, now sat for hours of questioning. Some clung to disbelief, but others recounted the sudden, jolting change in Madison's behavior. The details painted a picture of a woman desperate to disappear, punctuated by fleeting moments when her mask had slipped, when the pain and fear of her double life bubbled to the surface. Mark's heartbreak was palpable. He tried to defend her but ended up fueling suspicion with tales of her secretiveness and nightly panic attacks. The authorities now had a name, Sarah Anderson, and a real face. The dragnet intensified. As Madison raced south, she felt a sickening déjà vu, reliving every escape move from her past. She abandoned her rental car near a Greyhound terminal and melted into the crowd of late-night travelers, snagging a ticket for Memphis purchased with a fake ID. Her journey was punctuated by frantic texts to Jonathan, desperate for advice but knowing he couldn't do more than offer words of comfort and warnings to keep her head down. But the FBI was relentless. They traced the security footage from bus stations. She noticed plainclothes officers at rest stops, their eyes scanning the faces of weary passengers. At one layover she slipped into a restroom and emerged with a new wig and wardrobe, ditching her duffel in a locked stall. On a Memphis side street she switched rides with an acquaintance from her old life, trading what little jewelry she'd kept for a battered motorcycle and a crude forged driver's license. Days passed in a blur of tension. Each new city brought fresh risks. She considered heading out west, maybe as far as Colorado or California, but every time she hesitated, the fear of making a mistake paralyzed her. Meanwhile, the media caught wind of the chase. America's Most Wanted ran a segment on her presumed crimes and her ability to evade capture for so long. An artist's rendering of her possible appearance was plastered on TV screens and highway billboards across the South. Ordinary people reported seeing her everywhere: a diner waitress in Arkansas, a school volunteer in Mississippi, a hotel guest in Oklahoma. The deluge of leads made it hard for law enforcement to separate fact from fiction, but Madison knew it was only a matter of time before luck ran out. The chase became her life. Her world shrunk to fear, exhaustion, and the relentless need to stay ahead of the next close call. But with each frantic move she felt the noose tighten. Her story, once buried beneath years of careful planning and relentless caution, was now national news. And no matter how clever her next disguise, Madison could feel her options, and time, dwindling fast. The last days before the statute of limitations expires. As the statute of limitations on her crime neared its expiration, Madison Walker, now firmly established in her new identity as Sarah Anderson, found herself living in a kind of suspended, disconcerting limbo. For years she had survived by clinging to a rigid vigilance, her life a relentless choreography of caution and concealment. But as the fateful deadline loomed, Madison's grip on her own discipline started to slip, the years of constant fear and tension softening into a dangerous, deceptive sense of safety. In the weeks leading up to the end date, Madison's anxiety was mixed with unfamiliar relief. She counted each day like the ticking down of a clock in a prison cell, but where she once dreaded every second, now she anticipated freedom. She let herself imagine, for the first time in more than a decade, what it would feel like to exist without fear of arrest, to stop looking over her shoulder, to use her real name again, to stop rehearsing lies every time someone asked where she was from. She even allowed herself the occasional indulgence, taking a different route home from the bakery, lingering in markets a little longer, or chatting just a bit more openly with a trusted neighbor. That sweetness, however, masked the deep exhaustion underneath. For Madison, each small act of normalcy felt like dipping a toe into water she was never meant to enter again. Even as she tried to believe in her own invincibility, she knew, somewhere deep inside, that lowering her guard even for a moment might prove disastrous. On the surface, life in Nashville proceeded much as it always had. Sarah ran the bakery with steady hands and a practiced smile, but some of her staff began to notice she was less meticulous than before, forgetting to update orders, missing small details in conversation, and letting the usually airtight processes slip. At night, Madison would curl up in her tiny apartment, clutching the fragile hope that her ordeal was almost over. She even took out a calendar and marked the days, sometimes staring at the X's so long her eyes watered, as if by sheer will she could hurry time forward. Oddly, as the end approached, Madison started reconnecting with parts of herself she'd buried. She wrote letters, never sent, addressed to her mother, Jonathan, and Evelyn's memory, releasing years of guilt and longing onto paper. She let herself remember not only the fear and regret, but also brief moments of kindness and love from her past. Sometimes she almost felt herself softening, becoming again the girl who wanted nothing more than to belong. The hope of absolution, slim though it was, flickered somewhere beneath the grief. What Madison could never have predicted was how complacency might betray her. The very skills that had enabled her survival, hypervigilance, secrecy, distance, began to dull. She became more trusting with regulars at the bakery, confiding in them about inconsequential truths from her supposed childhood, or her struggles as a single mother. She lingered after work, sharing coffee with neighbors, or watching the sunset in the busy park down the block. The city, which had always been a maze of threats, softened in her perception and felt almost like home. She let her son Mark take on more shifts at the bakery, emboldened by her belief that they were finally safe. Mark, for his part, noticed the change in his mother's demeanor. She laughed more freely. The lines of tension in her face gradually faded. She was less inclined to retreat at every unexpected knock at the door. Unwittingly, Mark also let slip information about their private life to a friendly patron, a detail about family, a half-remembered accent, that would never have seemed risky before. Madison found herself going to sleep earlier, allowing herself to dream without interruption for the first time in years. She even planned a small celebration for the day her statute would expire, buying ingredients for a cake and hinting at a special occasion to her closest friends at the bakery. The shadow of dread, ever present for so long, had almost disappeared. But such peace was fragile. Even as Madison felt herself beginning to hope, she couldn't quite shake the habit of watching the news, scanning for updates, half expecting her old name to crash through the serenity she'd built. One evening, when Madison was closing up shop, a woman in her mid-40s entered the bakery just before lockup. She was new in town, she claimed, traveling for work. They talked about travel, about the best place for coffee, about the changing seasons in Tennessee. But after she left, Madison felt a faint, inexplicable prickle of unease, a sensation she tried to shake but could not ignore. She would later wonder if that was the moment her luck truly began to run out. What neither Madison nor Mark realized was that, as the days dwindled, the world outside had not forgotten so easily. True crime programs had featured her case over the years, wanted posters had faded but not disappeared. One afternoon, a regular customer at the cafe, an avid viewer of these shows, found herself staring hard at Sarah's face, the uneasy sense of familiarity growing with each glance. That evening, she pulled up images on her phone, compared old newscasts to the friendly woman who'd served her coffee that day. The jawline had changed, the hair was darker, but the eyes and the hesitant smile, those were harder to alter. The next morning the customer quietly tipped off authorities. Within hours, facial recognition tools flagged Sarah Anderson as a likely match. Blissfully unaware, Madison busied herself preparing for her long-awaited freedom. But as she stacked bread in the kitchen, two uniformed officers stepped quietly into the bakery's main room, their presence calm, but unmistakable. Seeing them at the counter, uncertainty froze her in place, a slow, cold realization spreading from her chest to the tips of her fingers. This was the ending she had always feared, arriving just days before she could have finally been free. Later, in the stark quiet of the holding cell, Madison reflected not just on her mistakes, but on how desperately she'd wanted to believe she could truly start over. The walls that had once seemed to close in now felt almost protective, no more secrets, no more running. She would face judgment at last, with all of the scars and hard-won wisdom her journey had given her. For better or worse, Madison Walker's days of hiding were over. But right before the finish line, fate had succeeded in pulling her back into the light she had spent so many years evading. Lessons learned from the case. Looking back on everything that transpired in the wake of Madison Walker's long, winding journey through crime, loss, and pursuit, I realize her story isn't simply defined by her missteps, nor by the headlines or wanted posters. Instead, her odyssey stands as a complex meditation on the consequences of choices, the shadows cast by trauma, and the limits of reinvention. The lessons left behind by her case stretch far beyond crime and punishment. They resonate on deeply human levels, teaching about accountability, the burden of secrets, and the high cost of denial. First and perhaps most jarring is the unforgiving power of one's past. Madison spent decades attempting to shed her skin, change her name, and bludgeon her memories into silence. She was expert at camouflage, blending in cities, assuming new roles, and outsmarting suspicion for years at a time. But the past, as her journey reveals, isn't easily outrun. Trauma bubbles up through the cracks in even the safest identities, and the consequences of actions, intentional or not, linger long after the moment has faded. For every day, Madison spent looking over her shoulder or sleeping with the lights on. The past was a silent companion, waiting for the right moment to demand reckoning. Her experience also speaks to the profound weight of guilt, regret, and moral ambiguity. Madison was not a villain in the black and white sense, nor was she purely a victim of circumstance. Each desperate choice she made, to run, to hide, to construct a new self, was born out of a blend of fear, love, and a flickering hope for redemption. Yet these choices became shackles in their own right. Guilt gnawed at her during quiet moments, chased her through sleepless nights, and shadowed any chance of genuine happiness. In her story, I see how carrying shame unaddressed can be more imprisoning than any cell. Another lesson woven through Madison's saga concerns the limits of reinvention. Changing appearances, names, and routines can buy time, but they cannot substitute for inner healing and honest confrontation. Even at her most cunning, Madison could never truly erase the old wounds, neither from herself, nor from those her actions affected. Meaningful change, the kind that leads to peace or forgiveness, requires something riskier than disguise, the courage to acknowledge our failures and the determination to seek genuine accountability. Her inability or unwillingness to do so led to a life of constant vigilance, every comfort shadowed by anxiety. Moreover, this case underscores the ripple effects of crime, how a single tragic incident reverberates through entire communities, hurting victims, perpetrators, and bystanders alike. Evelyn's absence, for example, wasn't just a matter for the authorities, it was a personal loss for colleagues, a wound to a neighborhood, a gap in daily routines. Madison's refusal to face justice immediately extended and complicated that pain, illustrating how concealment breeds suffering not only for oneself, but for countless others caught in the fallout. A subtler but essential takeaway from Madison's long fugitive status is the seductive nature of denial and the illusion self-preservation can create. For years, Madison believed that one more day of caution, one more clever lie, or one more move across state lines could finally guarantee freedom. But the pursuit of escape, while sometimes necessary for momentary survival, cannot serve as a lifelong answer. Her eventual capture reinforces a hard truth. Ultimate peace and true belonging don't live in secrecy, but in the willingness to confront reality, even when it hurts. Finally, Madison's life reminds us that justice isn't always clear-cut, nor is redemption out of reach. Her years on the run were filled with both cruelty and compassion, moments of selfishness and flashes of profound generosity. The hunger for forgiveness, sometimes from the world, sometimes from a loved one, often from oneself, was present even in her darkest chapters. Though her ending was marked by public disgrace rather than triumphant absolution, the final lesson is simple and devastating. We cannot outrun ourselves, but even in failure, the possibility for learning, change, and perhaps quiet redemption persists. Madison Walker's case became a mirror for society's questions about guilt, punishment, and the complexity of second chances. The echoes of her mistakes continue to remind all who hear her story that justice touches more than courts or fugitives. It defines how we face the truths within our own lives and whether we are brave enough to seek the forgiveness we all inevitably need.